Time to rock. All right.
TikTok.
TikTok.
Right. You're
Tell me
live.
when we're ready. Are we live? Okay, we are live. So if you are a follower of the Craig Reed channel, you may have noticed last week I had on what I thought was a really big, important TikToker. That's what I'd heard, that this guy Emerson Green is a really good TikToker. And then I get all these emails, these outraged TikTok people who are like, that guy isn't anything on TikTok these days. The real up and coming star of TikTok, you got to get Joseph Layman. You got to get Layman. He's the biggest thing on TikTok and he's just exploding. And I'm like, okay, the Madonna of TikTok, welcome, please. Layman. Oh my God, it's Layman from TikTok. Is it Layman from TikTok?
Dude,
Layman
on the
from
on the Travis Bickle of TikTok, guys.
The
Craig
Travis
said it
Bickle.
himself.
Yes, that actually, that video is hilarious where you do your Travis imitation. And then the next one you made, I like too. So your work on TikTok is important, Layman, if you want to start with your TikTok work.
Very, very important, nuanced philosophical debates. Really, you'll really learn about what the fundamental nature of reality is if you follow me on TikTok at Layman 1996 on TikTok.
Awesome. Have you actually been using it at all, or did you just sort of?
It's just a thing that I do when I'm bored and I'm feeling a little zany, and I'm like, I'll be like me and my personal friends will just be joking around about a lot of like stupid stuff, and something really clever will pop into my head during that, and I'm like, fuck, I got to make that into a TikTok.
This has got to be a TikTok. That's exactly what it's for. Like, it's just spontaneous. There's an aspect of TikTok that could be really fun and good that I just haven't quite nailed down yet. But I like it, actually. I think TikTok's fun. It's stupid, but it's fun stupid. It's not stupid.
Yeah,
it's not evil stupid. It's fun stupid.
Evil stupid. Yeah.
Well, I started using it in March when the coronavirus started. And at first I thought I wasn't going to be all that into like watching it, because I was like 15 seconds of video. How could that even be like, how could you even be interested? And then I found like 3 hours would go by, 4 hours. I was like, how'd that happen? Like just watching one after the other of these like stupid little jokes or these like tiny little sketches. And like, it's amazing how much time can go doing basically little bits of nothing,
Yeah.
That's what I found.
Yeah, it's perfect for that. Yeah.
Now, one of the other things that you and I have in common, then we'll get into the meat of it, is you and I seem to have similar taste in music. Is this true at least from what I gather, at least close to similar taste in music?
I have like the same taste in music as pretty much everybody, because I listen to everything. And like, a lot of that just happens to be stuff you also listen to, like David Bowie, and who else is it that you like aside from David Bowie? You like Pink Floyd, don't you? You're a Pink Floyd fan?
Yes, Pink Floyd.
Yeah,
the thing that we bond on, there was somebody put out the 5 albums or the 4 albums that were most important to you in high school or something like that.
Middle school.
Was it middle school?
It was middle school, yeah. I said that it was like Black Sabbath's self-titled album, My Chemical Romance, The Black Parade, and then 2 others that I can't remember. But I remember those two.
The Black Parade was after my time, but I actually love that album. I think they're a really good band. I like those guys.
Oh, I love them. Yeah.
Did you go see them?
I didn't go see them, no, but they are like they have like gotten back together recently after having been split up for I think like 8 years. So I'm really excited for if they start like making new material and stuff like that. I'm pretty pumped if that's the case, because that seems to be what they're hinting at.
Yeah, that would be.
Hello?
Uh-oh. That's Craig. I know last time Craig was
and the early David Bowies.
Sorry,
you
Craig.
Cut out, Craig.
Yeah, Craig, you went you deafened there for a second. What were you saying about David Bowie?
You like probably the same albums I like, the early David Bowie albums, like Hunky Dory and The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust.
I love all the David Bowie albums. My favorite one is actually my favorite one is actually Black Star, the one he made before he died. But my second, but I love all the old ones too. Obviously, I think my favorite one is actually Heroes, and then my third would be Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, and then Hunky Dory after that. And I actually really like Diamond Dogs too. I think Diamond Dogs is
Diamond Dogs is cool actually. A lot of people don't even know that album. It's good. There's a lot of interesting stuff on that.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of like really early punk sounds on that. And that album came out in 1974 before punk was even really like a genre. So
Yeah, he was influential on all that
yeah,
stuff.
absolutely.
Punk, new wave, like really influential on new wave. Like
Oh,
practically it couldn't
hell
exist
yeah.
without him.
Oh no, for sure. Yeah. Him and fuck, who else? I can't think of who else. Anyway. Yeah.
Influencing new wave, you could say Lou Reed and Iggy and T-Rex, maybe a lot of the glam guys. Not really sure how else you would.
Maybe
put
the
in there.
Clash did a little bit. Oh, I'm thinking of, I'm sorry, in my head I'm mixing up new wave and dark wave. Never mind.
Dark wave. I'm not even sure I know what that is. What is
Dark
that?
wave,
Is that-
dark wave is like gothic new wave, basically. So like predecessor to it was like Joy Division, then The Cure would be dark wave, and then like the Smiths kind of ish.
Right.
People like that, yeah.
I got you. So now let's go to you. You're a theist. Are you recently a theist, or is this have you always been a theist?
I've been a classical theist for a couple years now. And prior to that, I considered myself philosophically agnostic from the ages of 17. No, not 17. I would say about 19 to 23. And then before the age of 19, I was a pretty strong atheist. I was pretty confident that God didn't exist.
What years were that when you were the atheist?
So that was okay, so that was ages, I think, about like creeping on to when I was my 13th birthday to age 19 approximately. In
Wow.
between there.
So you were an atheist in high school. Was that like
I was
were
an
you
atheist in
raised
middle
Christian or
school.
something?
I was an atheist in middle school.
Was it like, were you rebellious? Were you like kind of a badass, like
Hell
stoner
yeah.
or something?
I wasn't a stoner, but I was definitely
Yes.
a pretty.
All right. I'm an atheist. Yes.
I'm an atheist, bruh. No. Okay.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so yeah. So growing up, like my mom was sort of, my mom just never really talked about religion. She just never really brought it up. But my dad is like very, very anti-religious. And so I didn't really know that until I was about 12 years old. And when I was 12 years old, I just kind of said like, hey, is God real, to my parents once. And I just asked them, and my mom just said that she didn't really have an opinion. And my dad was like, no, God's not real. What the fuck you talking about?
Wow.
God's not real. And like, and I didn't grow up with it, right? So as a kid, I was just kind of like, oh, all right, I don't care. I guess God's not real. And then my dad used to like show me all these videos of like the first person he showed me was George Carlin. He showed me like George Carlin stand up about religion, because George Carlin used to like rail on religion, not like atheist arguments, but like the typical anti-theist arguments that you would hear, like the classic comparison to like Sky Daddy, flying spaghetti monster talking point. I think George
you
Carlin
cut out
was
for
like
a second. Who was the first person he introduced you to?
Oh, he introduced me to George Carlin at first, and George Carlin's
okay.
Yeah, George Carlin's stand up on religion. George Carlin used to like relentlessly make fun of religious belief, and he thought that it was pretty harmful. He thought that it was in the same way that like Hitchens did. And through George Carlin, like I found it really appealing, because I was like, oh shit, like this guy clearly has the intellectual upper hand and he's very charismatic. So that was something that I was like, oh shit, this is something that I should look more
This is the real deal. This is
the
like
real deal. I'm about to school everyone with facts and logic. Hell yeah. So
So were you actually one of those? Were you like kind of an atheist?
Sorry, you
even though
cut
you
out for a
might
second.
call yourself agnostic. Were
Wait,
you actually
Craig,
one of those? Were you like in what?
Greg, I'm so sorry. You're cutting out a little bit. Can you please repeat that?
Were you actually one of those? Were you like an atheist? Were you like, doing debates and arguing people and going,
Yeah. Yeah. So
There's no evidence for the resurrection, things like that.
well, I didn't go in depth about I actually didn't go in depth about Christianity specifically outside of like young earth creationist stuff if people were talking about Genesis. So usually I would so when I was okay, so my dad showed me George Carlin, and that was that was like the gateway in. And then I started to watch a lot of young earth creationist debates. I remember watching this one from Hitchens and one from Dawkins, and then I would hear them like shit on young earth creationism. And so that was my gateway into that. And when I was I can't remember if I was 13 or 14, but I actually remember reading like a free PDF that I found of The Origin of Species. Like I don't think I read the whole book. I just read the section on natural selection. And I was like 13 years old and I read The Origin of Species, and I was so fucking confident. I was like, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to tell all these people they're wrong, and they are. Young earth creationism is a, you know, pretty unjustified position. And yeah, I just consumed a lot of content like that. And even when I was at school,
This is all on YouTube, right? There was YouTube when you were a youngster.
Yeah. Well, this was around like when YouTube first became a thing. This was like 2009, 2010. So YouTube was around for a few years at that point. And that was around the time when I think atheist content was around the height of its popularity at that time too.
Yeah, atheism was growing big. Like I probably started, that's how I got interested in it, was I started watching some of those like first wave atheists, like Amazing Atheist and Jacqueline Glenn and don't remember who else. Oh, Thunderfoot and Christina Rad. There was like this whole, they were really popular then. I guess they're still pretty popular in terms of numbers. They may even be bigger, but they just seem to be like more of a thing.
Yeah, a lot of those people just they just don't talk about atheism much anymore, but they're still pretty popular. Like Amazing Atheist is still like growing, and his channel is still doing really well. He just talks about politics now. There are a few people who are like that. I think Jacqueline Glenn also went in that direction too.
Yeah, she sort of trended out as she talks about like trendy sort of Onision,
just culture war stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, all this weird like YouTube stuff. Sometimes it's interesting. Sometimes I still watch them for entertainment. I was kind of just entertained by them, but it's how I started getting involved here was I just started with watching them. Prior to that, I had no inclination that there was even anything about this. You know, that was my first road into this whole. So take us to you. When did you start to become a theist, and how did that start to happen? And what type of theist did you become?
Yeah. So
unless you got more to say over here, that's fine.
There's events leading into that, I guess. So basically after that whole phase, I guess you could say, where I was like really into the like atheist debate me bro stuff, I started to so when I was 15 years old, this is going to sound like a pivot, but it's not. I started to really get into film, and I started to really get into just art in general. And I found like film really, really moving for some reason, and very profound. It was like an art form that really spoke to me, and I don't know why. And I remember watching Fight Club.
What movies got you? Fight Club, I remember that. I saw that with my wife. That's a cool film.
Yeah, so I watched Fight Club when I was 15, and I remember like this was one of the first like films that I watched that wasn't just some, you know, entertainment thing or whatever. And like it took me out of this sort of it like really, really changed me. Like up until that point, I was like really, really like I felt shitty just all the time when I was a kid, and I was really, really lazy, and I was so obsessed with like materialism, in the sense of I valued material possessions and material objects. Like that's all I cared about. Like I didn't care about having friends or anything like that. I cared about like video games and stuff like that. And that movie does this whole analysis of consumer culture and how that affects people, and you know what that does to a broader society, and how it alienates people and stuff like that. And I saw this and I felt very liberated when I watched it, but I was sort of liberated in the wrong way, because the whole point of the movie is the radical opposite of that, where everything is totally meaningless and you start to get into these, like, when you are alienated, you get into these really, really toxic communities with other people. And the Fight Club, quote unquote, in the movie was that. Like, it was an answer to their alienation, and they felt very liberated while they were in the Fight Club. But it also spiraled out of control and went haywire, and they wound up like destroying the entire fucking city by the end of the movie. Spoiler alert. So I that part I sort of ignored for a while, and so
Right.
I was just focusing on the whole like liberation from alienation materialism out of it. And so I was motivated to like, because I was pretty overweight when I was a kid, and I was motivated to like work out and eat healthy and stuff. And I had this sort of really, really individualistic, like, what's the word? Like this almost like Ayn Randian, like greater man, like hyper ambitious mindset to me and stuff like that. And I kind of got, but what I didn't realize was, like, while I was doing that, I was ignoring that toxic part. So I got into a lot of really...
What's that?
Oh, sorry, you cut out.
That started developing from watching Fight Club?
Well, I mean, that Fight Club was like the first gateway into that. Yeah. All these things kind of lead into each other. And I started to get into like, I started to get into like a lot of really bad communities where, like, mostly on the internet, because I wasn't really addressing the alienation part of that. I was just focusing so much on the materialism part of it. And everything that was bad about my behavior still sort of stayed there. So from there, I developed all these like insane like political opinions and these insane like like, okay, so the atheism ties into this. So I was at the point in my quote unquote like anti-theism where, even though I sort of gave up on the materialism element of it, I was sort of like, now I think that this is harmful to society, and it's spiritually harmful to people to believe in this stuff, to believe in religions and all of that. And I thought that it would have been better if there was some kind of authority to just like get rid of it. So I wanted this like really, really authoritarian kind of policy that just took away religion, like as a protected class, and everyone was just an atheist. And I thought that that would be, you know, better. And from there was a whole other bunch of shit. But when I was 17 years old, this is what made me question. This is the initial experience that made me question all this stuff a little bit. So when I was 17 years old, I started to kind of get like a group of friends who were actually like pretty good. Like they were good. Like it was good for me to be around them, and they looked out for me and stuff like that. And I slowly started to wean off of those beliefs through them. And I had this experience where I was still an atheist after this experience, but it made me rethink religion. And this experience was when I was in high school. I had a free period before my lunch period. So I had like these 3 free hours to myself, basically. And something I used to do was I used to go for these like strolls in the woods near my school on those periods. Sometimes I'd like do homework in there just because it was a nice environment to do homework in. And sometimes I just go out there to just chill out and be by myself. And I got lost once when I did this. I went like too far in, and the anxiety and the terror that I felt while that was happening was horrible. And it was so horrible that I was literally like reconsidering everything for a split second. And I was like, I was actually kind of praying a little bit. Not because I believed in God, but because I was sort of praying like for God to be real somehow at the time. I really, really wanted there to be something that just made everything that I experienced in my life worth it at the end of the day. And I really, really desired that because atheism isn't a position. Like there's positions associated with atheism, obviously, but atheism in itself isn't a like explanation for how the world works or anything like that, right? It's just sort of the absence of a thing. It's not a thing itself. So I really, really wanted something like that. And I had like my little freak out, I guess you could say.
So wait, you cut out for a second on that. You started praying for what exactly? Not praying to be delivered, but praying.
I was
You
praying.
cut out, right?
Yeah, sure. So I was praying for something to be there to fill in like the gap that atheism was, whether it was God or whether it was some other kind of higher like metaphysical purpose or something like that. You know what I mean? So,
And this was an actual prayer, like in the moment?
well, it was something that I just did like intuitively because I was terrified. I was like on my knees and I put my hands together and I was just like literally like yelling. I was so scared. And
wow.
yeah, and I mean, it didn't even have to be God at the time, right? I was just like, I need there to be like something that makes everything worth it. Like, just give me.
Was it kind of a primal, like, help me type prayer? Because I've had those prior to me being a Christian.
That sounds.
I was like, help me, just help me.
Yeah,
it was really primal though. It wasn't necessarily to God, but obviously that's the only person I would have been talking to.
Yeah,
I think entity.
Yeah, I think that's a good description. Like it was like 100% like this natural intuitive feeling that I have. It wasn't like a thing that I wasn't sitting there like, I should pray right now. It was like, because I was an atheist, I didn't care. It was obviously like this intuition that I had. Maybe I had some, ancestor thousands of years ago who, ancestors who did this, when they were in times of crisis, like to such a significant degree that passed on. That's what I thought of it at the time, right? But
well, it's like it's a primal thing, because I had that a couple of times, and this was before I was a Christian, where I was like, I would just cry out, and obviously you're crying out to God. You can see that as a Christian, but back then I was just crying out. I was like, how could you expect me to make sense of my life if this is what you've given me? Those type of things, and like, help me, those type of things, like, help me, like, and in recovery, a lot of people talk about moments like that, where they call like the moment of clarity or the higher power, or you just kind of cry out to something greater than yourself. It's not really specific, but I would say, the word I would use is primal.
Yeah, primal's a good word for it. It's a good word for it. Yeah, it was 100% like, I don't know, like maybe you could say it's like a survival thing or what, but yeah, it was definitely that. And so after,
can I just clarify how you got to this space? Because I was a little distracted when you were explaining that. You were terrified because
I was terrified because I was lost in the woods.
Okay.
I got lost in the woods. Like I didn't know where I was in the woods. I couldn't like, so I was near my school.
Right. So you were really scared. So you were like, oh my God, I'm actually lost.
Well,
and
I was like,
dark.
I'm actually going to die. That's what I thought. I'm going to starve to death in here and I'm going to die.
Yeah. I've had a bunch of those type of right at the edge of, oh my God, this is real. And this is terrifying moments prior to me being Christian. And yes, the natural inclination is to cry out in those moments. That's where the phrase like, there are no atheists in a foxhole comes from. Because in those moments, whether you're a believer or not, you tend to go, help,
Yeah. Well, at first it was like, at first I was hoping
like the only rational choice.
Yeah. For me at first, it was like, I hope other people are listening to this. And then I was like, nobody's listening to this. Please let God be real so God can listen to this. Like, that's how I felt at the time. And then after that happened, I sort of like, I don't know, for some reason I felt calmer after I did that. Cause I was just kind of like, well, I just did everything I could. And now there was like this moment of acceptance. And I was like, all right, I got to try my best after I did that. And I wandered in like some vague direction that I thought might've been the direction of my school. And I eventually wound up on the side of a highway. And I was like, all right, so I don't know which way to go on this highway. And I took a shot in the dark and I went to the right and I walked down and I eventually recognized this town that was like a little close to my school. And I was like, okay, I can get there from here. And then I was like, whew. And I was 10 minutes late for class that day, but yeah, it was like 2 hours of the most terrifying shit to ever happen to me. But
Wow, that's
after
intense. You should write that story down as a standalone religious metaphor. It's fascinating. There's a lot of stuff that people can do with that.
yeah, I thought of making a video about it someday, and I'm probably going to. I just don't know when I will. But I'm going to make a video about it someday. And yeah,
Or
after
have John
that,
write a screenplay about it. Have John write a screenplay about it.
John, write a screenplay about it, man.
Yeah, assign it to John.
Yeah, sell that shit to who made
Stephanie.
Castaway. Whoever made Castaway should make that movie.
Oh yeah, that's actually
Robert
there you go.
Zemeckis, is that who made Castaway?
Yeah, I think so. He did a lot of those Tom Hanks movies. Made him big. That might have been Zemeckis.
Whoever made Castaway should make that movie. But yeah, after that experience, I really so I started to really rethink, like, okay, so like I knew that like reasonably, I still didn't believe in God at the time. I was still an atheist at the time, but I
Right.
reconsidered the anti-theism thing after that. I reconsidered like whether or not this is actually harmful for people to believe in, because like for a lot of reasons that I won't get into, like my life was really shitty growing up like not growing up in full. I would say like from age 12 to that point, like my life fucking sucked. So I was like, okay, so I was like, people probably are using this for reasons that are not being presented to me from all of these like big brain new atheist guys that I'm following all the time.
Totally.
So,
Very, very, very good intuitive judgment.
yeah, so I was like, okay, maybe what this is, because I was still really into film at the time, and that was sort of like it was sort of similar to like experiences that I would see portrayed in films where people would be in really, really dire circumstances, and maybe, you know, in the world that film developed for itself, whatever fantasy world it was, they were you know, they would have like different rituals and different god figures and different cultures depicted in all of these screenplays. And I was like, okay, so I made this connection, like maybe what people are doing with religion is, or like functionally at the time, I was like, maybe what this is doing is it's sort of giving people this narrative purpose that I'm noticing in films. And so after that point, I was kind of like, okay, well, I guess if people believe in heaven, even though at the time I thought heaven was nonsense and didn't actually exist, I was like, you know, if someone goes their whole life believing in heaven, and if there is no separation of the mind and body, and if when we do die our brains just decompose and that's it, like at least these people aren't going to be conscious of it when they die. So them believing in heaven, even if I don't think it's true, isn't harmful to their well-being. That's what I thought of at the time. And so so I stopped being antagonistic towards religion after that, and I started to get
You started to see it more as a not necessarily true, but a bomb, an opiate, not in a negative, pejorative sense, but in a healing sense. Maybe a necessary opiative, something that people need in a situation like that, where you were truly hopeless, but you still cried out in hope, right? Yeah. Even though you didn't necessarily believe in God, it still helped you internally in an empowering way, I would say, right?
Yeah. And from there, I sort of viewed like religion's function as like, okay, so maybe like human beings obviously have this natural inclination to believing, maybe not in like Christianity specifically, but in some kind of like teleological spiritual beliefs or higher meaning or something like that. You know, maybe this is something people need to contend with their own mortality. And I was really into like evolutionary biology and
those
stuff.
Those are all normal inferences, and they're actually pretty perceptive based on your experience.
Yeah.
So those all make complete sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I started to, so once so after all of that happened, I don't know, I found that really comforting after I thought about that as deeply as I did after the experience. And I was kind of starting to like fill in the hole with things like film. So so after that is when I got like really into films, and films were something that I made like a ritual out of. It was like a pastime for me. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to find like a different film every day. I'm going to figure out like I wanted to see if there was something universal about stories in films that meant something to people, that connected with, like, why do people watch these? Why do people connect with these? Even if they're just watching it from like brain dead, like mindless entertainment, instead of like this sort of, you know, moving emotional experience for them. Like, why are people so into this and stories and, you know, novels and literature and all this stuff? And when I was halfway through college, this is actually when I got like my first girlfriend, was in college. And you know, well, I started to you know,
like, hey, you want to watch movies every day? Want to watch a movie a day and look for some narratives? Did I say narratives?
Well, I you know, I started to really think about like meaning a lot after that, right? Because that really changes how you view meaning and stuff. And from there, I sort of was like, well, like I'm not really like reasoning myself to these sort of like God isn't real positions anymore, because I started to sort of notice that like every film kind of has this pattern, no matter what kind of film it is, where there is some kind of like, it's not all good, right? There's well, yeah, arcs, right? But whoever the main character is, whether they're a good person or a bad person, there is always this sort of, here's who this is, and here's how they relate to what you think is good or what you think is bad. And then here's this sort of journey that they go on. And then there's some kind of tension that facilitates your engagement. And then it resolves in some kind of like transformation. And
right. It's like a hero's journey motif or an archetypal pattern.
That archetypal pattern, yeah. Which, I mean, I didn't think of it as that at the time, but I think of that now. And I was what was I going to say? Yeah, so I was at this point where I was like, well, okay, I think that there might be like, I was playing in my head like there might be some kind of like metaphysical foundation to everything, but maybe there isn't, because I was sort of stuck in like trying to, because when I was thinking about God, I was still tying it into all the baggage of like all of the Christian arguments that I wasn't really into at the time. Right. And I mean, a lot of them I still haven't explored today, so who knows? But so at that point, like I was kind of like, well, I'm kind of going back and forth in my head all the time when I'm actually thinking about God or not. And at that point, when I was like 19 or whatever, I considered myself like philosophically agnostic, where I was like, okay, so I'm obviously not sold on like the God position yet, but I'm at the point now where I don't think that I can justify atheism, because for one, and this is when I started to like really get into fallacies and stuff like that. I was like, okay, so I can't, like, even in like my worst times, I couldn't bring myself to like truly act like I believed that everything in the world could be chalked up to naturalism, because even at my worst time, I was still like praying for some kind of like supernatural thing to exist. And this pattern that I'm sort of noticing in all of these films, I don't know if there's like a natural cause for why I'm engaged in it. Like, sure, you know, people can feel tense, people can feel worried, people can feel anxious for all kinds of reasons that can be explained through natural means. But those explanations for me, sort of, this is the way I word it today, is like naturalism sort of answers the how to me, how things work, but it doesn't answer like why things work. So like,
and why do I think finding it so mysteriously compelling?
Yeah. Why do I find this compelling? Why do I think that this is, why do I think that this is moving?
It's you're engaging with films on a spiritual level.
Exactly. Right. And I was like, you know, like
whether you're a Christian or a believer at that, not really the issue. You're dealing with films like John Vervaeke, who's not a theist, would call that a spiritual engagement with film. You're engaging it on a much higher level, and it's really speaking to you. It's you know, if there is can you hear me? Am I out?
I can hear you. I can hear you just fine.
If there is a God, that's becoming your God and your relationship to God.
Yeah.
It's becoming really important and transcendent to you, and
but I didn't know
to a certain degree.
Yeah, but I didn't know if it was a relationship with what I would call a God today, which today God for me, because I'm not a Christian, so
right. No, I understand.
Yeah, my theism is
just
based on, yeah, no, for sure. My theism is based on just the general like definition of a God, like an ultimate metaphysical being that sort of is the like metaphysical foundation of like the universe and everything, and is sort of this, you know, what I would consider today, like how, you know, Aristotle and Aquinas put it, like this eternally causing creator in the ontological or cosmological sense, right? And but at the time, like I didn't know if what I was feeling was a relationship to that, or if it was a relationship to just something else that was unbeknownst to me.
right.
And I think a lot of my antipathy towards it was just because like I you know, I didn't talk about religion around a lot of people because all my friends were atheists, and my dad is an anti-theist, so I was constantly around like, you know, atheistic arguments all the time. So
Right.
that was sort of there to kind of keep me questioning, keep me guessing. And I think,
but if you had had new age friends or people who like friends like I had, there's a lot of like, at least when I was going through some of the same stuff, a lot of my friends were actors and punkers and hippies and stuff. And none of them were atheists. They were all talk about like sort of vaguely new age type God ideas, but they would be totally down to talking about the metaphysical aspects of what you're going through. They wouldn't necessarily define it, but they wouldn't say, "Oh, it can't be that." You know, there's no evidence for God. They'd be like, "Yeah, man, it's God speaking to you. Maybe God's trying to tell you to get into the movie." You know what I'm saying? People would be a lot more open-ended, but they would see things the way you were seeing things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, you know, I just started to realize at that point, because my foundation for everything before then was the scientific method and all the axioms associated with it. So all causal events are due to a natural explanation. That's how I thought about everything. And for me, like a lot of it was the big thing for me was like justifying like ethical, moral, like prescriptive decision making. So I couldn't, if I chalked that up to naturalism, for me, what the problem with that was because I was a total like anti-realist, subjectivist, whatever you want to call it at the time. And that was because like there was no scientific explanation for any of these things, right? Because if you're going to science to explain things like morality, like ideas that people have of like what they should and should not do, that's basically just like, hey, here's why people do things like confirm their own biases. Here's why people do things like have these, you know, natural feelings and drives towards certain things. But, you know, you can have a natural feeling and a natural drive to do anything. I mean, it doesn't say anything about the morality of the action, right? So
totally.
It seemed like I couldn't justify making ethical decisions, because even if I gave like an argument for why, so let's say, here's a common thing. This is a good like Steelman thing. So let's say I read a research paper on the effectiveness of like prosocial behavior. So instead of isolating myself inside of my house all day, I go and I socially engage with a community. And let's say I read a study that says, hey, if you measure whether or not people go out and they engage with their community, we can find like a correlation between people who do this and who do not do this. And the people who do this have a lot more like positive mental health outcomes because of it. And therefore, this can encourage people's like, you know, like it makes people's well-being better. Therefore, you should probably, I would prescribe like, hey, you should do this based off of this like scientific study because it makes people feel good. Like, and then we have to ask, like, what does well-being mean? Well, usually it means good physical and mental health, but both of those things presuppose naturalism. And so it seemed like if I deconstructed a position like that right down to its core, I couldn't justify it logically without committing a naturalistic fallacy. And so that's what brought me to a sort of more moral anti-realist position at the time when I was an agnostic, because I was like, if I decide to do things, I can't rely on these like objective, like naturalistic explanations, right? And I was sort of like, oh, everything is just like people's opinions as to why they should do things, and they just feel like that's the right thing to do. And, that's where I went from there. But this was sort of taking me down these really kind of selfish rabbit holes for me personally. And that caused me to like rethink my method of approaching that stuff. And so I was like, okay, for me to actually do something ethical, it seemed like I was at the point where, because I was literally just vibing at that point. It seemed like I had to ground that in something like that I could call that, like something that exists outside of how I feel about it, independent of whether or not I feel like it exists or not. Because I didn't feel like a natural inclination towards believing in a God. It was a position that I just purely was like, I'm just going to see if there's good reasons to believe in this. Because, and I mean, during experiences that I had, like, I definitely felt like it, right? And so I basically just looked into some popular arguments, like classical theistic arguments, and I was more or less convinced by like Aquinas's sort of like eternally causing, like, so outside of like the universe, whatever created the universe must have had like a necessary, okay, everything, sorry, I'm wording this really weird. Everything that exists in the universe must necessarily have had some sort of like assumed cause prior to that. And so Aquinas would say that there is this thing outside of the universe that is this sort of like eternally causing causer, this like prime mover that facilitates
the
universe.
Uncaused cause,
the uncaused cause. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Ground of all being.
Yeah. Right. So that's more or less what I started to call that. And when I was 21 years old, I, through another huge accumulation of personal events,
what?
When I was 22 years old, through this accumulation of personal events that I experienced, I experienced what I could only call, and what my psychologist at the time could only describe as ego death. And usually when people experience ego death, it's psilocybin induced through drugs like LSD and shit. But I was sober when I experienced this. And I literally felt like my entire world as I knew it was just done. And I felt like I had died. like who I was gone, and I had to rebuild who I was from the ground up. And that was where I was like, okay, like I'm biting the bullet on this. Like, not only have I reasoned this position for myself now, but now I feel like it's real too. So the reasoning sort of came before the feeling, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
What prompted the ego death thing? Was that like just something that happened to you, or what do you mean? Was it an emotional event?
Well, it was an emotional event. It was an accumulation of experiences that I had up until that point. Like my relationship was ending. I almost lost my job for something insane that happened at my work. My mental health was going in a really, really bad direction at the time as a consequence of the previous two things. And I was just like, I need to like completely reform just how I go about existing in the world. And now that I had reasoned this position for myself, I started to feel confident that I could actually say it. And this sort of is where we get into the perennialism, because
now before we move forward, would you say that the first thing where you started going into some of the intellectual arguments, would you say you were starting to become intellectually convinced that there was a God?
Yeah.
Is that one way of describing what was happening to you? Because that happened to me prior to me becoming a Christian. I was reading a lot of Jung and a lot of different stuff, like mostly New Age stuff, but a lot of Nietzsche. If Jordan Peterson were around when I was doing this, I would have devoured Jordan Peterson.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, when I had this experience, that's when I started to look into all this stuff. And it pretty much started with like, I had reasoned that like uncaused causer, prime mover, Aquinas, Aristotelian sort of view of, God. But that was like the reasoning. But then the actual like experiential element of religiosity came when I had this experience of ego death. And it was pretty much around this same time where I started to watch Jordan Peterson. And that was when I started to really, really like not just not just like, oh, I'm convinced that it is true logically, but I actually felt it like deep within my soul, you could say. And
Wow.
I really was like, so I read like, so I remember like I didn't care about reading that much at the time. They like this like when I read like Aquinas's argument, I read that part of The Origin of Species when I was like 13. Like these are the only books that I really read aside from like a couple like fantasy novels here and there, but I didn't like reading generally speaking at the time. And so I started to like hear Jordan say things like life is suffering and you have to accept that and you have to contend with that. Because before that, like meta-ethically, like before I heard him say that in the way that he says that, I was just like, my whole like ethical philosophy when I was in this sort of like anti-realism stage of my life was just do what feels good and just listen to yourself. And it was very like generic and shallow. But when Jordan Peterson would articulate like life is suffering, you have to accept that, you have to contend with that, and you have to do something about that. You know, I mean, everybody experiences different things, but ultimately this is sort of like a shared experience that everybody has where suffering is kind of inevitable in everybody's life. And the likelihood of suffering ought to be reduced insofar as it benefits your contention with the inevitable suffering that you're going to experience. And when I started to read Jung, after I read Jordan, I read both of his books, and I started to read Jung. I started to read Erich Neumann, who was a student of Carl Jung,
I know.
Yeah. And I started to read, but I also wanted to hear like arguments from like the subjectivist side too, but also like that tied into that. So I started to read Nietzsche. I read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Genealogy of Morals, and I thought these were amazing books. And there was an idea that I loved in The Genealogy of Morals that tied into reciprocity. So in The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche talked about how good and evil were these sort of.
Hold on, I gotta get that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
John, you want to take over for 5 minutes?
Yeah, it's cool. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can talk about Nietzsche
cool.
for a second.
I'll be back.
Hell yeah.
All right.
So, so I read that part. I read a part of, so there was a part on the genealogy of morals where Nietzsche sort of borrowed from Hegel's master-slave dialectic, but he applied it to morality. So he sort of came up with this idea of like master and slave morality, how good and evil are in this sort of ever-present dialectic with one another, and one cannot coexist without the other for there to be like any value to anything. Now, Nietzsche had a very, subjectivist approach to that, but it made sense to me. And from there, that made me want to read Hegel and read into Hegel's master-slave dialectic and read the phenomenology of spirit. And so I was pretty much at the point where I read a bunch of other philosophy too. I read like Kant, I read the Stoics, I read one book by Aristotle, I read the Nicomachean Ethics, I read a lot of Karl Marx too, because my best friend loves Karl Marx. And I just started to read like a bunch of shit from there. And I really got into reading. But I had these three things.
You were in your like early 20s?
This was a couple years ago. So this is when I was 22. 22, 20, going into 23. This is like late 2018, going into 2019. Yeah. And I had these like three sort of things that I was really convinced were like a really good thing to base my worldview on and to sort of like have a sort of like meta-ethical basis for existing, which was so the master-slave dialectic is basically like a radical sort of like very, very spiritual view of reciprocity. And I was pretty sold on reciprocity as an ethic. So you could call that the golden rule. And the suffering thing, as I said before, taking responsibility for inevitable suffering, deciding that responsibility must be taken so to contend with inevitable suffering. The likelihood of suffering ought to be reduced insofar as it benefits that contention. And
so is that like taking sort of a control, I guess, of the fact that suffering exists rather than like say being a victim of it or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, something like that. And then just sort of identifying it within my own life. And
Mm-hmm.
the reciprocity element, of course, would extend to other people, because Hegel was by no means like an individualistic person like I was before when I was 15, and I had these weird like Ayn Randian views.
Mm-hmm.
And so this inevitably entailed communitarianism. So it was like the golden rule, responsibility for inevitable suffering, communitarianism, and obviously, like, you know, the decision that meaning isn't derived from like materialism, material possessions, things like that. Materialism in the sense that I ought to value material things.
Right.
And when I was reading guys like Jung, and then subsequently, when I started to figure out like, what the hell is this? Like, what do I call this? And it wasn't actually until fairly recently that I found out that this is called perennialism, because all of these ideas are found in every religion, every like established world religion. And I can't find like any evidence of these sort of ethical ideas being fully articulated and attempting to be logically justified prior to these religions. You can find like, you know, primates and other, you know, mammals and stuff like that sort of interacting in communal ways. But as I said before with the naturalism thing, if we were to derive this from evolution, that tells us the how, but it doesn't tell us the why. Yeah, and that's why, you know, that's what made me accept all of this stuff is true, basically. And that's what made me accept it as a sort of, I consider perennialism a religion. Aldous Huxley considered it a religion. Some people consider it more of a sort of theological philosophy as opposed to a religion. But I think it fits like every credible definition of religion that we have thus far. So that's the label that I roll with.
I see. So sort of like looking at what are these sort of, I guess, perennial aspects to human culture or just the human existence, really, like the fact that life is suffering is something like that. That's you'll find especially deeply within the Christian religion, where the main archetype is Jesus on the cross. But also like within Buddhism as well. That's like the first of the Four Noble Truths, is the fact that life is suffering.
They're all dealing with, like, I just call it the problem of suffering. Like, they're all dealing with the problem of suffering that you know, many of us as beings experience. You can also find it in Taoism. There's a quote from like Lao Tzu that says, like, if you want to eliminate the suffering in the world, then eliminate all that is dark and negative in yourself. Truly the greatest gift you have to give is that of your own self-transformation. So there's a sort of death and rebirth element to that. This sort of like ego death element to it, which is another thing that I think is a perennial tradition as well, is to experience these sort of like this sort of like fall and then ascension in your life at different points in your life, and how that affects your existence. And of course you can find this in Islam too. So one of the prophets of Islam, I don't know that much about Islam at this time, but one of the prophets of Islam, he said, like, the prophets, then righteous people, then the next best, and the next best. A man will suffer according to his level of faith. If his faith is solid, he will suffer more. But if his faith is shaky, he will suffer less. The believer will keep on suffering until he walks on the earth with no sin. So it sounds like in Islam, like the way that they deal with the problem of suffering is in this sort of more like virtue ethicist based way, like all these other religions are, where you have to, it's not just avoiding it, because I mean, you're not going to suffer as much, obviously.
It was saying that the person who with a more shaky faith will suffer less.
They will suffer less, but they're not going to deal with it and contend with it in order to absolve themselves of sin. Because the way that I can frame this in like secular terms, I guess, like let's say that if so let's say I leave my stove running, and this is obviously a problem, right? Now, obviously, if I leave my stove running for long enough, it could burn my house down. But maybe if I don't pay any mind to it, maybe I don't care that my house is going to burn down. Maybe I don't care who suffers as a consequence of, you know, if my stove explodes or what. But if I deviate from this sort of like ideal this sort of like ideal action where I could stop the stove from killing so many people, you know.
Hi, sorry, I'm back.
Yeah, no worries, Craig. So
I had
maybe
to
if
go
I
get
could,
groceries.
you got
that-
groceries in that short a period of time?
No, I had to go unpack the car full of
Oh, okay.
groceries.
Oh, okay. No worries.
And now I'm either going to be banished to the bedroom or the car. I haven't found out yet.
All right. So Joseph was just going into some of the core aspects within like all the major religions and how perennialism is sort of the recognition of those core aspects, such as like the taking on the burden of suffering that's found within Buddhism and Islam.
That sounds perfect. Let him keep going.
Yeah, we were talking. Yeah, we were talking about this quote in Islam that basically one of the prophets said. So in Islam, it says the prophets, then righteous people, then the next best, and the next best. So this first quote sort of establishing this idea of self-transformation and responsibility. A man will suffer according to his level of faith. If his faith is solid, he will suffer more because he'll be engaging more. But if his faith is shaky, he will suffer less. The believer will keep on suffering until he walks on the earth with no sin. So I was just telling John that it's sort of this, in Islam, there seems to be this sort of theme of through your own virtue, you confront that which is facilitating
that almost
suffering.
sounded like a Christian parable, what you were just saying. That
Yeah,
could easily be transcribed into like a Christ-like. If you walk Christ-like, you'll know because people are confronting you, and blessed are you when they say bad things about you. It's almost very similar to that concept.
Yeah, because like just to lay out a definition of suffering, because when a lot of people hear suffering, they think of like physical pain, like physical like distress and hurt. But suffering as a concept like goes beyond that. It's just suffering is like the state of losing something which one could value dearly, or having that which one values dearly antagonized to some degree. And you can't live your life without having your values sort of, shaken a little bit. And if you don't pay any attention to that, I would argue that there's like a lot of negative outcomes that could come from that. So an analogy that I was giving John earlier was, let's say that you leave your stove running, and maybe like ethically, or just, how you feel about that situation. Maybe you're like not home. Maybe you don't give a shit that you left your stove running. You don't give a shit that that you might like set your house on fire. And I live in a condo building, so people live like directly next door to me. Maybe I don't give a shit if it explodes and harms those people. Maybe I don't give a shit if I'm held legally responsible for that. I don't give a shit if I go to jail. Maybe I don't care about any of that. Maybe I think like, hey, fuck it. Like I'll just take that on. I don't care. It doesn't hurt me, or I don't think it hurts me.
So you're saying like the more ethical you are, the more you're going to suffer in response to events.
Well, yeah, because if you're enacting moral behavior, you're establishing a value structure for yourself. And so if you have a set amount of values, for you to pursue what you value the most, you inevitably have to risk losing that or having that disrupted by what you value the least. And the more valuable things become, the more likely it is that the more undesirable things could come into the fold, right? So it's a sort of like I sort of view like life as a risk versus reward sort of thing that like God's facilitated for us. And so, this sort of ethic it's been beneficial to like just other people in my life to an immense degree, how I approach all my relationships. You can even find ethics like this dealing with suffering in things like Jainism, for example. In happiness and suffering, in joy and grief, we should regard all creatures as we regard our own self. There's more elements of reciprocity in there as well that I was touching on before. I don't know if you were here for that, Craig, but I was explaining how reciprocity, like the golden rule, is like a universal value. Even in like, you can even find that in Confucianism. You can also find it in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, yada, yada, yada. Like perennialism at the end of the day is just figuring out like what these things are, continuously trying to explore what these things are. I want to see if like there's more to all of the religions than what I just described. And I want to keep going into it as I read more perennialist philosophers. I've only read Huxley's like the perennial philosophy book so far, but I want to read more. And if these thinkers sort of like purport that there's something found in all the religions, like I kind of want to fact check them and see if that's the case and figure out like what these perennial traditions are, because like perennial like the word perennial means like something that has been everlasting and is everlasting. And I'm more interested in that than the more like relativistic approaches to all of these theology discussions. I don't like that a lot of conversations about religion focus solely on Christianity. I know that that's the common thing that everybody is experiencing and everybody is into right now, but I'm more interested in how it plays out broader, mostly because we can actually like measure how religion affects people and see how the outcomes of that play out. And the fact that that doesn't hold mutually exclusive religion in it tells me that there's a conversation to be had about perennialism that we're just not really having yet, I guess.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. There's a reason why I've always been interested in it. I mean, before I became a Christian, you could definitely, if I'd known there was such a thing as perennialism, that's what I would have called myself prior to becoming a Christian. But I wasn't really aware that there was such a thing. But I was attracted to some of the key ideas, like that quote by Blake, all religions are one. And I was working on some of the same things that you're kind of talking about. Like
yeah, I've heard some things just sort of, I haven't explored these, but I have heard that there are some philosophers of religion who believe that perennialism can be compatible with other religions. Like Friedrich Schwann, for example, is one of the biggest perennialists, and Friedrich Schwann is like an Islamic perennialist. He believes that perennialism is compatible with Islam because the Prophet Muhammad, I said that wrong. The Prophet Muhammad, through his like divine revelation or whatever, like he blessed all of these different religions to have all of these similar things, that like all the other existing religions were divinely created by like this same sort of God. But I don't know if I'm not really like convinced of that. So
well, that particular version isn't all that convincing, but I'm sure there are some Christians out there who have Christian type of perennial ideas that, you know, where they've thought it through and they could easily do some matching of it to some degree.
Because I hear from a lot of, I do hear in passing, and I haven't explored it yet again, from some of these more apologetic guys that like religion does account for the existence of other religions. And I'd be interested in seeing like how it does. I haven't looked into it yet, but I'd be interested in learning why that is. Because another problem that I had when I was an atheist was accounting for the fact that there are multiple religions. That was actually a really big problem for me because at the time it didn't make sense to me that only Christianity would exist, but then all of these other religions were just like in their totality wrong. But I've had other religious people who are Christians say like, oh no, like there can be like some truth to other religions. It's just Christianity at its core, like the core tenets of it, what makes somebody a Christian is what is ultimately true over these other religions. Which
right. I mean, that's a sort of perennialist idea. Like
it is.
Even some of the people we know have tried to account for other religions in a more conciliatory way or ecumenical way, is how it used to be called. Like there's my faith that.
Hello?
Uh-oh. We lost him again.
Craig.
Really important to me, but these other
Craig, you dipped again.
Oh, did I really?
Yeah.
No. It was a funny one. It was a good one.
No worries. No, continue. What did you say?
So there are even Christians who we know who have a version of Christianity that could account for a type of perennialism.
Yeah.
Where they say that other religions have a version of the truth, they just don't have the whole truth, or you know, it's really sad that they're all going to hell because they have a version of the truth.
Yeah, and these people would just call themselves like Christian perennialists.
Yeah.
And but here's like belief in God, for example. You don't have to believe in God necessarily to be a perennialist. You can't be an atheist and be a perennialist, but like you can be a perennialist and not necessarily believe in the ultimate metaphysical being, because there are some, because like Tibetan Buddhism, for example, isn't theistic, so that wouldn't technically be a perennial like idea under that, right? So I'm convinced of theism just because I'm convinced of the arguments by Aquinas, right? If I stopped thinking that that was a justified position, I could still consider myself like an agnostic perennialist at that point. Or maybe if I became like a strong atheist again, I could still go by like a perennialist, but like an anti-realist kind of perennialist. I mean, I don't know, but I think that if I stopped thinking that God exists, I don't think I would be an atheist. But if I
Right.
all I'm saying is that I could be something other than a theist and still be a perennialist.
Right.
Yeah.
And your grounding for your God belief is actually, you became intellectually convinced that there was a God, which is actually somewhat rare. So it'd be interesting to think through what you found so intellectually compelling about those arguments, not right now, but in general, because a lot of people would be interested in that.
Yeah, usually, I don't think I'm prepared to like get into discussions about whether or not God exists, because like what I used to do in the past was so if I mean, talk about
other Christians would be really interested in you fleshing that out, maybe in a standalone video of how you became intellectually convinced based on those arguments.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I bought the I purchased Aquinas' Summa Theologica recently because I want to read through the arguments in depth with what I know now as opposed to what I knew back then, and see if I can tie that into my perennialism somehow and then explain it that way. But when I would try to like, so I know that there's like a lot of semantics around the word God in the sort of theism versus atheism kind of debates like online and stuff. Not so much in like academia, but in the communities I would engage in, I know there's a lot of semantics. So before I tried to do this like a couple years ago now, where I talked to Adam Friended once about my belief in God, and it was a total shit show because I couldn't like define it in a way. I couldn't define my idea of the properties of God and what God was in a way that made sense to him. Because he assumed that I was coming at it from like a typical like Christian apologist perspective, and I wasn't at all. And there's so many things that I have to establish before I can even have the conversation. Like I need people to agree that something supernatural can exist before I even talk about God, because I don't see a purpose otherwise. And so there's like so many stepping stones.
Do you think in that moment that you talked about in the forest, do you think there was some supernatural agency involved in that? Or do you think it was just a primal thing from bottom up? Or have you thought about it?
Well, I have thought about it. No, I hear you. I thought about it, but I sort of go back and forth between whether or not it was a divinely inspired experience or whether or not it was naturalistic. Now, I am leaning more towards the sort of like divinely inspired element of that, because again, it's about the whys and not the hows. So me feeling like that, how I felt like that was obviously naturalistic, but why that feeling came to me in that moment is
why that primal, what we both kind of said was like a primal urge. Where that primal urge comes from is ultimately mysterious. If you're an atheist, mysterious. If you're a Christian, you know where it comes from, or you think you know.
Or if you're a theist of any kind, you know where it comes from. And so the way that I think about it is like, okay, like if I felt like this, if I had this primal like naturalistic feeling, it's like, well, okay, so my explanation for it before when I was an atheist was I probably had some ancestors who practiced these rituals back in the day, this intuition towards this passed down to me probably somewhere in my lineage from there, but who passed it on to them, and then what passed it on to them, and what passed it on to them, because obviously human beings haven't always existed on the planet Earth. So, this sort of thing came into fruition somehow through some kind of process. Right.
To say that primal idea makes complete sense with a theistic point of view is controversial, but it's only controversial to atheists. It's not controversial most believers would go, yeah, obviously, that's part of what happens.
Yeah, because you have to break everything down back to whatever the initial cause of it was, whatever the first cause of that thing was, and obviously God would be that, right? So that's the position that I'm leaning towards right now, right? But sometimes I do go back and forth in my head because it was like, it just like I didn't shower that day. I felt filthy, like an ape feels filthy, and the environment was so naturalistic that sort of tugs at my head a little bit and gives me doubts, right? So I play these little intellectual games in my head about that from time to time.
Now, before we run out of time, let's go to you had your at least one debate where you presented your argument for God, or your argument for, I call it the secular utility of religion. What are you calling it? You didn't seem to like that label.
I don't even call it secular. I usually just call it I don't consider it a secular thing. I just consider it like religion. If you are secular, if you are an atheist, if you're a typical secular humanist, utilitarian kind of person, you don't have to be anti-religious. In fact, I would say being anti-religious is an unjustified position, because there is an overwhelming amount of evidence under, their own philosophy, scientific method, logical deduction, utilitarianism, yada, 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 that justifies permitting people to participate in their religions and to believe in their religions in and of themselves, and that having positive outcomes on society from a secular humanist point of view, from the point of view of well-being, point of view of human flourishing, all of these different things. And
right. It's too bad you didn't present that when you were with Adam, because he's actually really into that argument. That's one of his main go-to talking points.
Well, yeah, but I already know that Adam is convinced of that, right? So I wasn't interested in that. But I
got you.
I know that Adam already believes that. So it's not, and Adam is already familiar with this literature because Michael Jones has presented like some stuff from this literature as well in the debates that he has when people debate with Michael Jones, Christianity is dangerous, right? Hello, Craig?
That debate is really strong. That inspiring.
Sorry, yeah, Craig, you're cutting
that original inspiring philosophy. Yeah, you are too, a little. That original inspiring philosophy versus Matt Dillahunty. That argument is really strong. That's his strongest version of it.
Yeah, when I first watched that really was like, okay, like any little bit of anti-theism that might have been left in me was just gone after that, because I decided to, so I really wanted to look into that stuff myself as a perennialist, because I heard him, this was actually from his Aaron Ra conversation where they had the same debate over the same topic. And in the Q&A, somebody asked Michael a question that was really interesting to me, where he said, do these studies just look at Christians, or do they also look at Buddhists? Do they look at Hindus? Do they look at Muslims? Like, is this just a Christian thing? And Michael said, I think his response was, they are Christian majority samples, but you can find like most of them were done in Western countries. So obviously, they're going to be sampling Christians.
That's the religion they're talking about, right?
Yeah. But there are like representative samples where they'll have like a minority Muslim and a minority Hindu and a minority like
right.
Islamist.
Well, the social cohesion aspect is a no-brainer. I mean, that's inarguable that it presents a form of social cohesion that's really, really strong. I mean, that's obvious to see. That's part of the success of religion in general.
But just saying that by itself doesn't convince like a secular humanist, right? Because a secular human, that just opens up philosophical arguments where a secular humanist could say, well, we can just replace these sort of more utilitarian things with secular humanism. We can still have these things. And that is technically true in a sense. But here's the thing. There's like tons of meta-analyses, and I can give like the exact names of the studies. If you want to put them all in the description of the video, I can like send you them after this. But like there is several meta-analyses. There's one on self-control. It encourages religiosity, no matter what religion you are. Like there is something about religion that gives you like self-control, self-regulatory strength. It promotes pro-social behavior, which again, that would tie into the social cohesion element of it, but it also like deters people from substance abuse. It encourages altruistic tendencies. So that ties into the reciprocity ethic that I was mentioning before. It can deter you from crime. It can deter you from other forms of drug use. There's even one study that found that longitudinally, tolerance of racial outgroups. So if you compare, and I guess this is where I get into the definitions, the way that this is looked at scientifically for those watching who aren't familiar is there's two categories you see pop up that are measured through a statistical model called the religious orientation scale, intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity. So when they're looking at what people believe psychologically, intrinsic religiosity is where your master motivations are the religion in and of itself and whatever its tenets are. So your reason for performing an action ultimately at the end of the day is because you, let's say you're a Christian, you believe in God of the Bible, you believe
being
Jesus
Christ-like,
resurrected.
and
You
you basically
want to
practice what you preach. It's actually
Yes.
really motivating force in your life, and you're internalizing it to some degree.
It's not just a motivating force. The important part is it is the primary force. And
Right.
where extrinsic religiosity is where that motive is not primary. The primary motive is other ends that you have. And this can be a variety of different things. This can be, oh, I'm religious because I like to go to church and be a part of a community and make friends. I'm religious because I'm depressed and I want to have some kind of like meaning in my life and social cohesion,
Right.
or I'm depressed.
Or like if you're in a Muslim society, you'll be religious because you need to fit in and have your kids, be in the in-group and be successful and stuff like that.
Oh
So-
yeah. Or if you live under a theocracy, I'm religious just because the government tells me to. Right. Like these are extrinsic, excuse me. These are extrinsically religious things. Or in the other way around, if you are the theocrat yourself, religion is being used as like a political means to an end, right? You could justify it that way. But again, it depends on the temperamental motivation. Like I can't read everybody's mind. And that was kind of the point. That's kind of the point that I make whenever I debate this stuff. Because a common argument against these studies that I hear from anti-theists is that intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity are just a no true Scotsman fallacy. And you're just, all the bad things, because all the studies show that like all the positives that I just listed, the social cohesion, the positive mental health, racial tolerance, there's other things too, like just overall, like even just subjective life satisfaction.
But there's slam dunks in terms of the meta-analytic studies. There's slam dunks. Like all the things that you mentioned for intrinsic religiosity are actually like, really, really well traversed studies that basically prove what you're saying.
Yeah, they also
Right?
there's also some studies that suggest like it attenuates death anxiety too. But extrinsic religiosity is like the opposite. Like all of the
Right.
like from a secular perspective, all of the negative outcomes are from extrinsic religiosity. And that's just what the data shows at the end of the day. Like, regardless of whether or not this data exists, it doesn't affect like my religiosity, right? This is just like me looking at this because I'm interested in it.
Right.
And,
But how many debates have you done on this, by the way?
well, so I did that one with Peter, and recently I went on a Twitch panel where people were talking about religion and politics, and I debated like a large group of anti-theists, and there were no other religious people. It was like me and like 5 other anti-theists.
You against you and the Lions Den? Did you win?
Oh yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I won, but it was just sort of like this informal kind of debate panel that I went on it. They had like 20,000 Twitch followers, and
you haven't debated it on TikTok as of yet, right?
I'm not doing debates on TikTok, Craig.
No.
That's not happening. That's not what TikTok is for me. But but a common
Well,
so
I was going to ask you a question though. The follow up to the how many debates is, so how are you explaining to somebody who's doesn't agree with you the proof of the extrinsic versus intrinsic? How are you proving those two separate categories? So when they accuse you of saying that's a no true Scotsman fallacy, Joseph, you say what? Shut up.
So usually,
Shut up. It is not.
Hey, get out of my face. No, I say like, hey, well, I tell them it's not, and here's why. So usually it comes up as a no true Scotsman fallacy, because what they'll often do is they'll cite an anecdotal example. So they'll say like, oh well, like Kent Ham has all of these like schools that he's opening up, and all of these schools are teaching kids fake spirit science and stuff like that, right? And I'm like, well, yeah, I agree that that's harmful, but whether or not that's due to the religion in and of itself isn't something that we can actually demonstrate, because this is an anecdotal example, and I can't read Kent Ham and all of his employees' minds. They could be intrinsically religious. They could be extrinsically religious.
And their examples are all these like anecdotal, like basic propaganda examples that they've got from this particular video or that video. Or,
yeah, and I mean, they think it's a no true Scotsman fallacy, because I'm trying to pivot them away from those examples, and I'm saying like, we can't know this. We have to look at what the studies say and how this affects people's behavior, because like biblical literalism is a thing, but you don't have to be a biblical literalist. And I mean, you can be an intrinsically religious person and be a biblical literalist, but you can also be an intrinsically religious person and not be a biblical literalist. So I'm always tell them like, it's not a no true Scotsman fallacy. Like I'm not telling you that they're not Christians or they're not religious. I'm telling you that I don't know. And even if I concede, and I should have said this to Peter and the other people I talked to, but I should have said like, even if I concede that they're all intrinsically religious, there are tons of philosophical arguments that you can make that fit the Bible. Scriptural things can be made compatible with the theory of evolution through a lot of other ways. You don't have to deny the theory of evolution. Ultimately, like whatever scientific fact you get, you should be able to accept that the scientific fact is true, even if you believe in God, because because at the end of the day, like this is like the first cause. This is the answer to the whys. Science answers the hows, right? Science doesn't give this like intrinsic.
There was actually a stream today on capturing. Right. Totally. And they're not mutually exclusive. You can believe two things at the same time that don't actually conflict with each other at all. They may conflict some places culturally, but that doesn't mean that they're intrinsically in conflict or dichotomous by any long stretch of the imagination. And
I mean, the Bible was written. I mean, the Bible is like thousands of years old. Like, it would be ridiculous to think that whoever, like, whether it was God or whether it was man divinely inspired by God or whatever, to say that they were purporting a scientific theory as we understand the scientific method today is obviously ridiculous, right? Like these people were not suggesting that like Noah's flood and all of this stuff was a scientifically demonstrable thing. From what I understand, this is like a uniquely modernist view of Genesis, where you have people like Kent Ham. I think there was like a book, from what I heard about like young earth creationism, like the arguments for it that you typically hear amongst those circles. From what I understand, in America, at least, or North American culture, like a lot of those arguments were first put forward by a guy who wrote some book in like the 50s, and then it got into all of these schools and stuff. And like, I don't know, but regardless, like it seems like a uniquely modernist thing, because people weren't really freaking out about this until Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, which Darwin wasn't proposing that as a, attack on theism or attack on Christianity or anything like that. Darwin was just saying like, here's some natural observations I made that I think accurately explain like humans as the biological organism that we are and stuff. So it seems compatible, but we're going back to before, like, they'll cite these examples, or they'll cite some historical examples about witches being burned, or like the Crusades, things like that, right? Like, oh, look at all these wars and religion is associated, therefore religion is the cause. It's like, well, there's all kinds of naturalistic reasons and naturalistic explanations as to why people engage in warfare. Like you can literally go back, like chimps used to do territorial raiding for like resource acquisition on like other outgroups, like perceived outgroups and stuff like that. Like all of these things, like unless you think the chimps were doing it for religious reasons, like like, you know, I mean, it's just silly. I mean, under
even the ones that are technically religious reasons, when you dig deeper, you find out that there's a lot more going on. Normally, it's money, land, status, and power are the real things that people go to war over, and the idea.
Lost Craig again.
Associated with is usually, you know, money and the power.
Sure. What were you saying there, Craig? About
you cut out again.
Religions used for power or something?
Well, the main, even when you dig in, the main source of the conflict is quest for money, land, status, and power. Even when the ideology is in conflict, it's just an excuse to some degree to get the land or the, you know.
Yeah, it's a post hoc justification for other ends. And if someone said that, like, I would propose that as an alternative to one of those sorts of anecdotes. I'd be like, you know, there's other potential explanations as to why these things happen. China today is like one of the most imperialistic countries like that exists right now. They have like one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and they use that to their advantage. And they're an atheistic state. Like they have state atheism legislated. Like obviously, you know, and that's the thing, right? This is something that I try to bring up to people. It's like I would never pose as an argument as to why atheism is harmful, that like Joseph Stalin was an atheist. Therefore, if you're an atheist, you're going to commit all of these like acts of atrocity and stuff like that.
You're going to commit atrocities.
Yeah, like, you know, there's all, I could do the same thing with this. This is why, and when I bring that up, it's always interpreted as me positing it as a counter argument against atheism, but I'm not doing that at all. I always try to explain, like, what I'm saying is that by your own standard, atheism is also harmful if this is what we're going with. So
right, but once you bring up Stalin and atheism and Soviet Union atheism, then you set off a whole chain of events. Oh, yeah. You're saying that Stalin, that state was an atheist. Yeah, you set up a whole bunch of stuff.
But then they do the same thing because it's like, oh, you're saying that those people were not intrinsically religious. That's a no true Scotsman fallacy, which I don't do. But then if I say like, oh, well, there was like this society that they were all they identified as atheists. They enacted this thing called state atheism. In the Soviet Union too, they denied the theory of evolution as well because they thought that it was bourgeoisie propaganda. And if I say this, then all of a sudden, no, that's not real atheism. You know what I mean? It's like, you know what? Totally. Fair enough. Like I'm not interested in citing these examples to argue against atheism. And I'm not interested for the same reason that I'm not interested in citing these one-off examples of religious people doing bad things. Like religious people do bad things all the time. It's called original sin. Like, you know, like, right. So, I mean, you know, it's just silly. And it's these annoying like arguments from anecdote. It's like, why can't, and appealing to history to make psychological claims of how people behave today is just, it's so disanalogous to me that it's like I'm almost speaking an entirely different language than them. And if I'm speaking an entirely different language than them, then how do you even have a conversation, right?
Yeah, well, didn't you find that to some degree on the Peter's channel?
Did I find? What do you mean? Did I find
that you guys were kind of having two separate conversations?
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. Yeah, like. God, I get like we got into all of these like weird semantic things, and it happened like afterwards on Twitter too. When we talked about stuff, he'd be like, no, religiosity religiosity has a different definition than religion. If I would say something about religiosity, and then he would try to categorically separate like religiosity from religion for some reason, I don't know, but and there were all of these weird little moments like that. And then when I brought up like the Stalin thing that I mentioned before, he said that Stalin was a fundamentalist Christian, which was really funny to me. Wow, citation needed, please. Like, but
He may have
Like,
technically been raised as one.
he did grow up in like a fundamentalist household, but to suggest that he was enacting fundamentalism into the Soviet state is a little silly to me. Like, he obviously was not a Christian when he was in power and was on his way to acquiring power. So I mean, but again, like, these aren't arguments against atheists or anything like that. So I don't really like to harp on those too much. And I said that to Peter. The other guy I was talking to was way more reasonable. But
in that particular chat, or just in general?
No, in that particular, in general, I find him more reasonable, but in that particular chat, he was too. But yeah, like, at the end of the day, like, the studies say what the studies say, and I just go with that. And I think, and I've thought about this. I don't know if I'm going to make a video about it, because I want to make a video on why I'm a perennialist someday, and that's going to be something that is going to take me forever to write.
Yeah,
and I want to tie all of this data into it somehow, because the fact that they sample a plurality of religions in these studies, and they all seem to have these similar sort of effects. There was actually one study that looked specifically at intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. I think they focused on people in China who practiced Eastern, sort of like Chinese religions, and it was one of the studies on death anxiety, and it was one of the studies that found that, like, there was a strong correlation between intrinsic religiosity and attenuation of death anxiety, whereas like extrinsic religiosity made the death anxiety worse. So
worse, yeah, because you think you're going to be punished.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly, right. And there's another, okay, there's two other arguments against these studies that I hear that I want to go through real quick. So the other argument I hear is atheism all of those positive effects, I can accept that all those positive effects happen if you're intrinsically religious, but you can be an atheist and we can have these positive effects too without believing in God. And that's a good argument, right? That's been a very convincing argument in a lot of these debates, because usually what people are doing is they're getting really into the nitty-gritty and they're citing like a biblical ethics and stuff, and they're saying like, hey, we like these biblical ethics more than the secularists will be like, yeah, but we can do these things and secularism can exist too. And obviously, rhetorically, the Matt Dillahunties of the world come out on top in those conversations, right? But what the more powerful argument, I think, is that these studies control for that, because if you take somebody who believes in a religion but is doing it for all of these other ultimate reasons, they'll say like, oh yeah, like you can get community, you can get good mental health, all of these things you can get if you just let go of like the God belief and do that. But a lot of these researchers will say, well, what's ultimately motivating that behavior isn't the fact that they're engaging in the community and doing all of these things from a secular perspective and are just, the religion is just a thing on the side. It doesn't really matter that much, because that's extrinsic religiosity. And when they're doing it for these reasons, all these negative effects come up. And the people who are intrinsically religious, a lot of these researchers will also say, if you read their papers in full, that like, if these people stopped being intrinsically religious, like there is and this doesn't mean it'll necessarily happen, of course, but there is a likelihood that these effects are not going to be the same, right? Because you've created an entirely different control variable there. So, I mean, there's no causal evidence because it's social sciences and there is no causal proof that you can demonstrate in like sociological studies, but you can apply control variables and make these reasonable inferences once you apply these control variables. Now, another argument that I hear that I think is really a good like steel man against this stuff is they'll do the thing where they point to the Scandinavian countries and how they have a good social welfare system and how they're more like voluntarily decided to leave religion because they have, I think like 30% of people in Scandinavia are theists. And, they'll say like, oh, well, they have these like good social welfare and all of these things like improve people's well-being as well. And then they'll present a lot of evidence that these things improve people's well-being. And it's evidence that I agree with completely. But the response to that argument is usually like, why, in order to achieve those outcomes, do we have to get rid of religion to achieve those outcomes? Because you don't have to. You can have you can have good social welfare in a society and still allow people to be intrinsically religious. These things aren't
It's not an either or.
Well, no,
It's like-
they're completely compatible ideas. It's like the reason why those social welfare programs come into fruition in the first place isn't because of atheism. Like there's no, like that's not atheism that's doing that. Like, God, even under like a Christian worldview, you can justify that stuff because it helps the poor a lot. And I mean, God, like
Right.
what such a strong ethic in Christianity is like help the poor and attenuate to the poor's needs. Now, you could argue that maybe there's an institutional element behind that where charity organizations feel they're threatened by it because technically social welfare does a better job at helping the poor than charity does. But that doesn't mean that, again, it's one of those things where it's like it's not one or the other, right? You can still have people, like social welfare doesn't cure the world of all of its problems. You can still have these things and you can still encourage like virtuous behavior out of people to help the poor and all that stuff as well.
Yeah,
so
totally.
I usually just put forward like we can both collaborate on this and commune on this. Like these are not mutually exclusive things. So those are like the three really good arguments, or the best arguments, I should say, that I hear against this stuff, but I just don't think they hold up to scrutiny.
Yeah, I would agree.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. I think that I can,
like you said, they're not
Hello?
What? Can you hear me?
Sorry, you cut out there. What you said?
They're not mutually exclusive. They're not either or mutually exclusive. You can have both.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So, Johnny, do we have questions?
We've got a couple, but if anybody else wants to throw in some questions in the chat, we've had quite a few people stopping by watching. We've got Lord Bryant; he's a fan.
I know Lord Bryant.
Yeah, we also had Kafai, the also resident sort of perennialist that follows Craig's channel.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to get you two guys on together and talking about perennialism. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yes.
He had asked if you've read any of Ken Wilber or Alan Watts or Terence McKenna to sort of inspire your perennialism.
No, I've not read any of those people. I actually didn't know that Alan Watts was a perennialist. Alan Watts was always framed to me as like a new age Christian. So I always just assumed that that's what Alan Watts was all about. But no, I didn't know that Alan Watts was more in the perennialist camp. So maybe I'll check him out in the future. Yeah,
I know he's sort of like on the, I guess, edges of all the different religions. Very much sort of New Age, but he quotes a lot of Buddhist works, and I don't know. He sort of seems like the Jordan Peterson of his time. Sort of,
he was more like the Deepak Chopra of his time, but with a little bit of the Peterson.
Yeah, I got more of like a Deepak Chopra vibe from him, which is kind of why I like sort of had an antipathy towards him. But if he has like these perennial ideas, I'm certainly willing to check him out. Yeah.
I guess I just had a sort of more general question. What do you sort of like in the sort of like most basic form? What do you mean when you say that you're a perennialist?
So when I say that I'm a perennialist, I mean that I believe that all of the world religions and all of our religious ideas as we understand them today sort of share like one common metaphysical source, and like that is what God would be to me. And all of the universals in religions, as opposed to their mutually exclusive differences, are what would comprise the quote unquote like religion of perennialism. And to me, like the way that I look at religion is I sort of view them all as one cohesive narrative through that lens, as opposed to these mutually exclusive worldviews that just so happen to overlap in some ways. I'm like, I have like this really firm perennialism where I'm like, what is universal in these religions is the religion for me, if that makes sense.
Okay, so that's interesting then. Like, there might be some sort of New Age movements that will say, like, yeah, there's these common aspects to the religions, and we can sort of leave off the other sides of the religions and just sort of hold to the common truths held by them. But your point is, I don't know, maybe that like the religions themselves have a narrative for the people within them to live by. And if you sort of pick out the theological beliefs, but leave out any sort of narrative aspect, then you're sort of missing a strong component to the religion.
Yeah, because if you're leaving out the narrative aspect of it, and you're leaving out what these stories actually represent, because like I as a perennialist, like I still want people to talk about like the meaning of Christ's death and resurrection, and I want people to talk about like the meaning of the Tao, and I want people to talk about like what like the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism like actually mean metaphysically. Like I want people to talk about all of these things, and I want to facilitate that as much as I can. And if I was to sort of set all the narrative elements of it aside and just look at the commonalities in and of themselves, devoid of the actual religious component of it, then you're pretty much just at secular humanism. And I'm not a secular humanist.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's how I look at it, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. I thought there was another question here. Oh, Lord Bryant is saying that they started some sort of like a definition war on what atheism is.
Yeah, we've been in like this really long thread with a bunch of new atheists about the definition of like the lack of belief in God versus not.
Oh, where's that happening? That's on Twitter right now.
Oh yeah, it's been like 2 days now of just endless notifications.
That's my favorite. I gotta check that out.
It's like me, him, another person who's like a friend of his that follows me that's more of a secular humanist, at eboyleon1 on Twitter, and then Steve McRae is also in there, and we're just like having a go at like new atheists about their like, I just lack a belief in God.
That's when it gets good.
I don't actually have any positions to give. I just lack a belief in God. I'm just sitting here lacking belief in God. I don't have any positions. Like when like you know that that's not true. Like
yeah,
I just saw
there's the Braxton dilemma, which I love, that like somebody will say that they lack a belief in God, and then they'll analogize belief in God as being similar to a belief in Santa Claus or in fairies. And those are like two contradictory positions because like to say that belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus or fairies is to make a analogy to something that we know doesn't exist, or we believe doesn't exist. Like we don't lack a belief that Santa Claus exists.
So if presented with good evidence, you will believe that Santa Claus exists. And that's the kind of posturing. It's like, look at me, I am the rational following evidence. And there was a oh God, what was his name? I can't remember. There was a philosopher of religion who had a really good argument against that definition. So this lack of belief in God thing came from a philosopher named Antony Flew in the 70s. He wrote this. He wanted to sort of make atheism more defensible, and what he did was he came up with this definition, lack of belief in God, because he thought that it could best serve as an umbrella term for a wide variety of positions that were identified with atheism, like more naturalistic beliefs just in general. And he wanted to come up with this, like, here's like just a thing that unifies them all. And he came up with this. He came up with these adjectives of like strong atheism and weak atheism. So he wanted to develop this like taxonomy that differentiated specific types of atheism. But the problem with the argument, and I really wish I could remember this name of this philosopher of religion. This is what I believe. So the argument overlooks that like if we define atheism as the like not a position, it's just a psychological state of belief in God, then no proposition. If you're defining it as not a proposition, then atheism can't be a proposition by default. So not positing the position that you don't believe in God can't be atheism if you're defining it as a lack of belief, because that's a position. And if atheism by definition is not a position, then you would have to call not believing in God something else aside from atheism. So that to me is like where that definition of atheism falls apart, right?
Well, it's also not telling us anything about the ontology. It's only telling us about your psychological relationship to the proposition God exists. But
Yeah.
it's not saying anything about whether God actually exists or not.
Well, exactly. And that means that if you're saying something about God not existing, if you're positing that God doesn't exist, by definition, it's not atheism. It would have to be something else. That's more so how I'm viewing it as. This is why a lot of these like atheist activist websites will say that like that is the one definition of atheism. And they'll pretend that these other definitions don't exist. But like there's these problems that, these categorical problems that come with that. So
I agree. I definitely agree.
Yeah. But that's about it. If you guys want to wrap up, we can.
Yeah, we should wrap it up. Do you want to come back and do either a stream with Kafi or I think that would be actually really good. It's up to you though.
Yeah, no, that'd be awesome to do a stream with Kathy. Yeah. I would love to. And yeah, I guess to close, like my name is Joseph, but my internet moniker is Layman. You can find me on YouTube. My YouTube
and
name
TikTok.
Follow me on TikTok if you dare. My TikTok is at Layman1996.
If you dare, your TikToks aren't that groundbreaking.
My TikTok is insane.
His TikTok is off the charts. It's where it's at. It's the newest thing in TikTok. What did CNN say that about you? Did they really say that you were like the most important voice in TikTok?
They really said that I was an international treasure and that if my TikTok didn't exist, we would probably see a lot more death and famine in the world. But because my TikTok exists, the world is materializing itself at its very core. Yeah.
The other thing we could do is we could have mini debates. This is something I wanted to have on the channel for a while, where you present your secular utility of religion argument, which you don't want me to call it, but that's the only thing.
If you want to call it that, I don't care. Labels are labels, dude.
But you can present it, and we'll have like we'll do one of those devil's advocate type debates. We'll set you up with one of our crushers, like maybe dry apologists will beat you, or Barton theology, even something like that. We could do that. That would be fun.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. There's a YouTuber who has like 4K subs right now, who's an anti-theist, who's a pretty smart guy. He normally talks about politics. He doesn't talk about religion that much, but he is like an outspoken anti-theist, and he agreed to have a conversation with me on his channel. And I'd like to talk to somebody who's like a really, really smart guy like that about this stuff. So his name is Mouthy Infidel on YouTube, and we haven't set it up yet, but he wants to do that at some point. So yeah,
that sounds cool.
Yeah.
All right, but
yeah, you can. Yeah,
so you're officially chickening out of dry apologist. Is that what I heard?
Dry apologist can debate me all he likes. Yeah.
Oh, so you're calling out dry apologists. Awesome. I love it.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so perfect. So you want to close her out and tell us where you found? You told us where we can find you on TikTok. You are what? Layman.
Yeah, I'm Layman at Layman 1996. On Twitter, I'm at Lay_man_.
Yeah,
and on
I
YouTube,
also have,
it's just Layman.
Yeah, I have your YouTube channel and Twitter in the description. And if you send me those meta-analyses for Intrinsic Religiosity, I can put those in the description as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. That'd be awesome.
All right, awesome. Okay, perfect. Well, you guys have a good one. Thank you for inviting me on. It was a fun conversation. And yeah, you guys.
Yeah, it was really good. And that is all she wrote.